Those who try to mimic Martin Luther King's homiletic power invariably end up looking sort of silly. And that actually happened to one of the first who tried it. When the young king was a finalist for a church position for the prestigious pulpit of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, he delivered a trial sermon called The 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life. It was a brilliant pitch, with just the right touches of erudition and oratory, and it reflected to an accomplished, cultured congregation exactly how they understood themselves, striving to develop their best self, service to community and to God. 3 dimensions of a complete life. Well, the other candidate for that pulpit, hearing the good reports about this young king, wanted to somehow go one step further than king, and followed the next week with a sermon entitled The 4 Dimensions of a Complete Life. As you can imagine, his pitch fell completely flat. It's best not to come into a pulpit the Sunday after Martin Luther King. And yet here we are, after King, in our annual attempt to find words that can recall King's powerful voice or tell us how to take a step further than King. Doing so is always a hazardous exercise, not only because it can make preachers look silly, but because King has become so many various things to our memories. That young pastor is now remembered as a prophet, called by the Lord before he was born and given a mouth like a sharpened sword, one who led a people out of bondage to the edge of a promised land. Yet King has also become a national hero of a country called the United States, of such stature that some call him a second-generation founding father. His legacy has become one that makes presidents stand up, to use the words of Isaiah, before which our elected princes prostrate themselves, no matter how far their own politics may diverge from King's. He's also a cultural icon, used to construct various portraits of ourselves. So for a white preacher, the hazards of memory include an impulse to celebrate King the Integrationist, because that lets Euro-Americans celebrate a man ready to forgive white racism and see the goodness of all Americans. King, that nice man with a dream. Remembering King that way can let us ignore the landscapes of racism in which we still live. And perhaps most perilously, King is remembered as a saint. His has become a definitive Christian life. There's a statue of him in Westminster Abbey. You can buy religious icons of him. He's featured often in our prayer litanies. Those are not necessarily bad forms of memory. I have one of those icons myself on my office wall. But remember Dorothy Day's line about not wanting to be called a saint because she did not want to be so easily dismissed. Sainthood leads to 2 kinds of dismissal in King's case. First, Christians like to commemorate the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. because we want to claim his work as the church's. But during his life, King, of course, was often snubbed by churches who saw his mission as too socially involved, too dubiously political. Early on, he had hoped to work with Billy Graham, but was rebuffed. He had hoped for support from the National Baptist Convention, his own denomination, but was subtly ignored. He became frustrated with Christians, North and South, black and white, liberal and conservative, who would listen to him in church, but not show up for the theological drama happening in the streets. He repeatedly wondered aloud about churches that could tell the story of God, but could not see it happening around them, about Christians who worship Jesus, but refuse to put themselves at risk for others. One of the most devastating lines from his letter from a Birmingham jail is directed at the churches of the white moderate pastors to whom he was writing. I drive past your beautiful churches, and I wonder what kind of people worship there. Who is their God? Yet King grew frustrated with churches at the same time as he grew closer to what he understood to be the body of God. For King discovered that the God of justice and the Jesus of love was real, where people were putting their bodies on the line for the sake of their neighbors and their enemies. These people did not always identify themselves as Christian, King saw. That did not diminish the spirit of Jesus Christ among them. In fact, their actions shored up King's faith in the reality of the gospel. So Christians like to remember King as a saint of the church, but if he is a saint, he became one when he was not in church. The second way that King suffers dismissal by sainthood, we tend to remember King as one whose power and vision was with him from the start, one who was called from before he was born, formed in the womb, and given a mouth like a sharpened sword. Such a strong image can overwhelm those of us who may aspire to justice but know ourselves inadequate. Here's the memory of an unequaled prophet bearing an authoritative vision. It can dampen the expectations of we ordinary ones living in ordinary times who do not see a theological drama in our own streets. We would not presume to make righteousness flow down like a mighty stream. But King did not start out that way. He did not arrive in Montgomery looking like a mighty prophet. That first sermon of King as a ministerial candidate, The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life, is surprising for how little it contains of the prophet we remember. It's a little stuffy, surprisingly safe. It's an edifying homily, no doubt. But there's no foreshadow of a movement to end segregation. There's not even really a passing swipe at social injustice. There's no hint of a challenge to those in the pews to risk themselves for the sake of others. That is, in fact, a major reason why the congregation at Dexter Avenue liked it so much. They were exhausted with their previous pastor, Vernon Johns, who was as confrontational as he was learned. Dexter Avenue had hired Johns because he knew ancient languages, could reportedly recite the whole Bible from memory, as well as volumes of ancient and modern poetry. It is in fact said of Johns that although he never needed the pulpit Bible, he worked through 3 of them by pounding on them during church. The congregation became mortified of Johns because he refused his role of edifying the cultural elite and instead bluntly ridiculed segregation and publicly shamed his own congregation for being more concerned about social status than social justice. Tired of Johns making trouble, Dexter Avenue was looking for safe, and they hired Martin Luther King, Jr. Oops. What happened to their safe bet? Well, he got caught up in the trouble of God. Within a year, King fell almost accidentally into a role as the voice of the Montgomery bus boycott. There he glimpsed what he would later call God becoming real in history. And perhaps the greatest credit to his faith is that once he caught that glimpse, he gave himself over to it. Once he glimpsed the reality of Jesus moving by, he knew what he was looking for, and he followed to see where it would go and what it required of him. King learned his call from that movement, from that mission of God. At first, he was not a pacifist, but when he was taught Gandhian tactics from the movement veterans, he saw in them the Spirit of Christ and made them his own. He still wasn't really sure how nonviolence could be redemptive until he saw the students using their bodies to reveal and absorb racist violence. In their actions, he recognized the pattern of the cross and developed his own commitment to the redemptive power of suffering. He learned from Rabbi Abraham Heschel and from the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh to connect the civil rights struggle in the United States to the struggle against injustice everywhere. From them, he learned how his Christian personalism must expand to a cosmopolitan humanism. He moved his family in amongst the poor in Chicago, and from them he learned how civil rights depends on employment and fairness in housing. From them he learned that justice includes in economics. King's distinctive genius, his prophetic genius, was to learn what his lexicon of love and justice meant by walking with those who seemed to have something of the Spirit of Christ in them. And the more he walked, the more maladjusted he became. The first time King let loose that trademark verse, justice rolled down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, it was in support of a pretty modest adjustment to bus segregation laws. By the end of his life, when he came to that verse in his sermon, it supported a moral vision that insisted on full integration, employment for all the poor, decent housing for every family, the end of American militarism, and a turn away from the materialism of the American dream. The waters of God's justice had carried King further than he could have imagined when he first uttered that voice during the Montgomery bus boycott. So when we remember that verse, when we remember King, we're not only forced to confront how sick our society still looks in light of King's final vision, we're invited to enter those waters ourselves and be changed by it. That is the womb in which King the prophet was formed. King preached that sermon, the 3 dimensions of a complete life, over and over in his career. Reading those versions over time, you can watch his development as he turns that safe sermon into an increasingly dangerous call to get into the waters of justice or miss out on the reality of God. By the year of his assassination, by which time he was alienated from most churches, that sermon had turned from edifying to edgy. He still affirms that one dimension of a complete life includes self-development. He, in fact, underscores that you must rightly love yourself. But then he adds the Good Samaritan parable to say that Christians should not try to value their security apart from others, which means not valuing yourself more than helping your neighbors, or by working for change in your city, or by joining the movement that is God becoming real in history. He adds to the sermon a note of judgment by invoking the saying of Jesus, "Whatever you have not done for the least, for the hungry and the imprisoned, you have not done for me." King's gloss on that verse is blunt. On that day, Jesus will say to those who are more concerned about their careers than their neighbors, "Get out of my face." By the year of his death, for saying things like that, the one we remember as a prophet, a hero, an icon, a saint, had become unpopular. He saw that civil rights would be meaningless if anyone's humanity was disfigured by poverty, so against the advice of his strategists, he joined a poor people's campaign. He saw that there could be no possibility of nonviolent change in a nation trying to change other countries by war, so against the advice of his remaining friends, he came out against Vietnam. He saw that when citizens are too involved in their own ambitions and their things, they don't get involved in movements to confront racism or to help house the poor, and they support wars undertaken to protect their resources. So he denounced middle-class materialism as an obstacle to justice. King became more maladjusted the deeper he let his life be transformed by God's mission of love for neighbors and enemies. In fact, in the last version of the 3 dimensions of a complete life, King tells us that that is how he hopes to be remembered. "In my eulogy," says King, anticipating a nearing end, "I would like it to be said that I tried to love others." In explanation of this maladjustment, this complex social vision, he says, "Remember me as one who tried to witness to God by doing something for others." Cornel West says of this that by the end of his life, King had learned that the meaning of human life reduces to this question: to what will your death bear witness? And King wanted to bear witness to the attempt to love others. Maybe the most hopeful thing about King's legacy is that he learned how to do it to some extent. He learned how to bear that witness just by getting involved, by showing up and letting the waters of justice carry him along. You don't need to first have a divine mandate to do justice. You don't need the sharpened sword of a complete social theory to try to love your neighbor. King loved to say that you don't need a PhD to figure this out. You don't need a powerful position. Just go to where people are trying to love others, especially where they're trying to love enemies, especially when they're doing it for the sake of the poor, or the desperate, or the homeless, or the imprisoned. In our gospel today, Jesus sees some people following after him, and he asks them, "What are you looking for?" And they reply, "Where are you staying?" And he says, "Come and see. Come and see. Come and find the justice you seek but don't fully understand. Come and learn the love that is your humanity. Learn to love those called enemies. Learn to seek justice with the poor of this city. You can start today. You can take a step with the homeless who in this city struggle to find beds even in the midst of this cold winter. Do that and you'll glimpse the Spirit of Jesus and you'll find your own humanity. That's how King said he wanted to be remembered. Show up where the reality of God in history is happening, and you'll start to see that theological drama in your own street, and you'll be on your way to the several dimensions of a maladjusted life.